So hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Catherine DeVita. I'm the training coordinator for the Digital Research Alliance of Canada. And it is really a pleasure to invite you all here today to take part in this joint presentation hosted by the Alliance and by Local Contexts. So before we begin, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to take a moment to recognize that we're gathering today on the unceded territory of Tiohtià:ke, known to many as Montreal. So this land has been the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, who have been the stewards of these lands and waters for generations. Tiohtià:ke has also been a gathering place for many other First Nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Abenaki, and others who have maintained connections to this land, both in past and in present. So as we come together here, it is with the acknowledgement of the ongoing presence and resilience of Indigenous peoples in this place. Their histories, the languages and cultures continue to teach us and to enrich our land and our shared communities. So as we proceed with our webinar session today, it's with the acknowledgement of the First Nations, the Inuit and the Métis Nations, and communities who have been harmed by colonial and unethical research, and of the data sovereignty and research priorities of these nations and communities. So on behalf of the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, we commit to understanding and taking up our role in reducing harm and advancing reconciliation in research. So a quick code of conduct. So the Alliance seeks to provide a welcoming, engaging, and safe community for everyone. So discriminatory language is not appropriate in any venue or platform. The Alliance does not tolerate harassment in any form. And so harassment can be understood as any behavior that threatens another person or group or produces the feeling of an unsafe environment. So to give you a quick overview, so in this session today, we're joined by Local Context. So Local Context is the Indigenous focused not-for-profit organization supporting the recognition of Indigenous rights and interests within cultural heritage and science collections and data. Local Context has an Indigenous-led governance structure to promote values of transparency, self-determination, and the Indigenous leadership. They have a staff of 10 who support the development and the delivery of Local Context as key Indigenous data sovereignty cyber infrastructure. So joining us from Local Context today, we have Maui Hudson, is from Whakatoeha. He is a council founding member of Local Context, as well as an associate professor of Te Katoi Research Institute at the University of Waikato, focusing on the application of Mātauranga Māori to the decision-making across a range of contemporary contexts, from new technologies to health, the environment, and to fields of innovation. So Maori supports Māori to engage in the research sector and advocates for the Indigenous rights and interests through Te Mana Waraunga, Māori Data Sovereignty, the network, and the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA. Also joining us from Local Context is Emily Santhanam, is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation and the Local Context Outreach Manager. Within this role, she supports multifaceted efforts for the outreach by cultivating and sustaining Local Context's network of Indigenous communities, institutions, and researchers. Prior to her involvement with Local Context, Emily worked in multiple curatorial and research capacities for cultural organizations and museums. And finally, we're joined by Ashley Rojas, who's a software web developer focusing on API implementation of the hub's labels and notices into the digital infrastructures and managing the Local Context website. So Ashley is originally from Lanipahiking, or New York City. She received her bachelor's degree in classics and classical archaeology and her master's degree in digital humanities. Her interests lie in bringing technology to the forefront of learning, and her work has been focused on museums and archaeology. And so at this point, it's a pleasure to hand it off to our speakers from local contexts.
Hello, Catherine. Thank you for the warm welcome and introduction. Look, we're really excited to be able to share this presentation and these tools with this community of research data management professionals and librarians and university staff, people associated with the research data lines. We're really looking forward to the sorts of discussions that might emerge from this presentation today, and especially around implementation opportunities or possibilities within the Canadian context. I have to remember to talk slowly, and I have to also remember to not use too many Māori words because I'm not sure how the translator will deal with that. Anyways, my name is Maui Hudson. I'm a member of Whakatoa here. And as has been said, I'm one of the council founding members and a strategic advisor, and currently a interim executive director for local context. I'll just pass it over to Ashley to introduce herself, and then Emily.
Yeah, thanks. I think Catherine's introduction was wonderful. I'm currently based in, I used to be based in Lenape-Hoking or New York City. Now I am based on the lands of the Wappinger homelands in so-called Connecticut in the United States. And yes, software web developer, focusing on the API implementation of the labels and notices, which we'll kind of get a bit more into later on. And I'll pass it to Emily.
Yeah, Chukma. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Catherine. My name is Emily Santanam, and I'm the Outreach Manager for Local Context. And I'm based on the lands of the Red Willow people in Taos, New Mexico, which is in the southwestern part of the United States. And I would like to have our colleague Amy June jump in just to introduce herself. She won't be presenting, but she'll be helping us monitor the Q&A.
Thanks, Emily. I'm really glad to be here today. My name is Amy June. I use she and her pronouns, and I've been with Local Context for about 6 months as an outreach coordinator. I joined Local Context from a background in the fine arts and kind of winding through the social sciences and social research, particularly with crop development. And as Emily noted, I'm not here to present, but I'm here to try to help answer questions. So feel free to utilize the chat and Q&A, and I will get to those throughout the presentation as I'm able. Thanks.
Now, before we begin the presentation, I would like to share our organizational land acknowledgement. Local Contacts as an organization transcends geographic and national boundaries, and we acknowledge that all of the lands and waters that we occupy are Indigenous homelands. So we recognize that ongoing significance of these lands and waters for Indigenous peoples in the past, present, and into the future. Our work is really focused on addressing the ongoing legacy of settler colonialism and in supporting a more equitable future. So we try to do a land acknowledgement to disrupt settler colonialism and to recognize whose lands we're on, as well as our responsibilities as guests here. So with the next slide, we can move through a little bit of the agenda for today. We will plan to present for about 35 minutes, reviewing the local context organization background, a bit of overview, diving into our notices, which are our tools for researchers and institutions, then moving into our labels, which are our tools for Indigenous communities. Lastly, we're going to try to reserve 15 to 20 minutes for questions, ideas, and discussion.
Thanks, Emily. So yeah, Local Context started in 2010, and it was really developed as a way of trying to address some of the issues that were emerging at the intersection of IP law, cultural heritage, Indigenous knowledge, and some of the effects of colonialism that have impacted on the ability for communities to access and control their knowledges. And so the innovation that was developed at that time, or at least the first innovation or first tool, was the traditional knowledge labels, or what we call the TK labels. And they were really created as an intervention to bring Indigenous cultural authority back into cultural heritage spaces. Following on from that, over the last 15 years, we've then developed additional tools like the notices, and we'll talk more about these as we go along, but act as a sort of a disclosure of interest that sit against these kind of digital artifacts. And then eventually we did some work to develop biocultural labels, which are really more associated with scientific data or genetic data that's generated from Indigenous homelands. And this initiative had been really moved forward through the actions of, in particular, Jane Anderson at New York University, but also universities in New Zealand as well. And in the past, in 2022, we moved it into a sort of a non-profit space, so 501c3, not-for-profit, registered on the Navajo Nation. And since then, we've really established an Indigenous-led council as our governance model for moving this initiative forward.
Yeah, so I can take it over from here. This slide shows our team, which is made up of our council, which Maui just mentioned, as well as our staff. Our staff is composed of a tech development and design team, an operations team, and lastly, an outreach team. So as mentioned, we are an international organization based primarily across Turtle Island or North America and Aotearoa, New Zealand. So we are mostly connecting remotely, but are occasionally able to connect in person for events, conferences, and training programs. To give you an idea of the widespread interest and application of local contexts, here is a map that shows our global connections of communities, institutions, and researchers who are either interested in or who are already using the local context system. So as you might be able to see, our connections are particularly strong in North America and Oceania because that is where our team has been based so far. We have largely been working in English, but are growing to support other languages and geographical areas as well.
And so across Canada, and this is really just a little bit of a zoom, and you can see the range of communities and institutions that have started to engage around the use of local context in our tools. Currently, there's around 7 active communities using local context, and an additional 13 in conversation. First Nations were some of the first users of the labels, and a number of the labels have been developed alongside them. They continue to be used by those nations, by their governments, and in sort of museum and different cultural centre language departments and organisations. There's around 16 institutions, Canadian institutions, that are actively using local context, and another 40 odd that are in conversation. This includes universities, libraries, museums, database platforms, national regional government agencies, and we'll be able to look at some examples of these as we go through the rest of the presentation.
Yeah, so while we're talking about our connections both globally and within the Canadian context, we do want to take a moment to talk about some of our terminology that you'll hear today. So we'll sometimes use the term community as more of an international way to talk about First Nations, tribes, bands, confederations, land councils, and similar collective sovereign groups who have ancestral ties to the lands and natural resources where they live, occupy, or from where they may have been displaced. In following the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also known as UNDRIP, we recognize that sovereign right of Indigenous peoples to self-describe and to determine qualifications for membership and citizenship. So the communities that we work with can be represented by entities like tribal historic preservation offices or TIPOs, cultural centers, language departments, land councils and corporations, as well as tribal archives, libraries, museums, and colleges. When we use the term institution, we're referring to organizations that do not have Indigenous governance and that have or generate Indigenous data or collections. So of course there are Indigenous institutions, but we will always specify in those cases. The institutions we work with include galleries, libraries, archives, museums, research institutions and labs, universities, and really range in topic and scope. Lastly, when we talk about researchers, we're referring to individuals who are conducting research or generating data. So the researchers we work with are likewise diverse and span multiple fields. We do use these categories knowing that there are many individuals who do occupy multiple roles and affiliations, so our organization does recognize the many hats that people wear, especially Indigenous people who are working in these spaces. So we do strive to be inclusionary of that kind of positionality as well.
So just by way of a bit of background to the sorts of ideas that prompted the creation of local context and the challenges faced by Indigenous peoples. Every Indigenous community is dealing with enormous collections of their tangible and intangible material that are held in archives, museums, libraries, repositories, all these institutions that Emily was just talking about. Often in those places, there's significant information about those collections where information is missing from the record. Largely Indigenous communities are not the legal rights holders. And this sort of misinformation and misattribution continues to affect the community's ability to find the information, but also reassert some degree of control. This isn't just a historic problem, but it's also one for the future, as there are more and more researchers working to collect data and samples from communities. And so there's sort of intellectual property issues or issues of ownership, as well as incomplete and significant mistakes in the metadata, continue into the digital life of that material. So in this era of big and open data, these sort of mistakes and omissions that exist in the metadata are replicated in far-reaching digital forms of this material. So with these issues, the Indigenous communities we work with, we're looking for a way to intervene and interrupt these systems.
So from this need, the labels and then later the notices were created. Both the labels and notices are digital labeling tools. They are markers of Indigenous rights, interests, and cultural authority that can be used in a variety of contexts. They are one potential tool that can help to operationalize the care principles for Indigenous data governance and the First Nations Indigenous Governance Centers, or OCAP. We have seen the labels and notices used digitally in collections, catalogs, archival records, apps, websites, course syllabi, publications, and so much more. We have also seen a few uses outside of digital spaces. We'll start with looking at the notices and then talk about the labels, sharing overviews, and then some examples of each of them in use.
Yeah, so as we have mentioned, local context origin is really with the TK or traditional knowledge labels, but the notices were developed when our leadership came to realize that institutions and researchers are also on their own journeys in this work, and that they can do something to help make visible Indigenous data and collections, so that communities can find their knowledge, belongings, ancestors, and to be a part of the decision-making about their access and use. So here at Local Context, we believe that institutions and researchers have a responsibility to disclose Indigenous collections and data and recognize Indigenous rights and interests. So to help with that, we created our notices. The notices can help to disperse some of the labor that can be involved in this work from communities back on to institutions and researchers who will often have greater familiarity with their data and materials. The notices were developed to create pathways for partnership, collaboration, and support of Indigenous cultural authority.
The notices are digital tags for labeling Indigenous data and collections. They were designed to be flexible. A notice could be used on a website, on a collections database, or more specifically on a single item of cultural heritage or a data set. We describe them in three categories, each with a function to communicate different Indigenous interests. First, the engagement notice, open to collaborate. This notice is for institutions or researchers to commit to ethical, reciprocal engagement with Indigenous communities. This is often where we see institutions and researchers start. Next are the disclosure notices. The disclosure notices for identifying and sharing where there are Indigenous collections. This is working towards a challenge of supporting Indigenous communities to find and access their collections and knowledge. There are three disclosure notices: and attribution incomplete, traditional knowledge, and biocultural. The third category, collections care notices, were developed within the past year in collaboration with the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. These were created for collections and physical storage stewarded outside of communities. to make clear when specialized cultural care is needed. Unlike the other notices, these notices are designed to be printed to physically label collection spaces and are used after consultation with communities. We do not have any examples of this because they're an internally facing tool, and we largely would not expect the collections these notices apply to be public facing.
Yeah, so here we can review what a notice looks like. It has three main parts. So the notice, unlike the labels, have standardized titles and descriptions, which you can see here. They are simplified markers of Indigenous collections and interests, and they are currently available for translation in our hub website in English, Te Reo Maori, Spanish, and French. So we'll now highlight a few examples of notices in use in Canada so that you can see what's possible. We'll also showing a few examples of the varying scales where notices can be applied. So this first example is the use of an Open to Collaborate notice from a research project titled Can Peat, Canada's Peatlands as Nature-Based Solutions to Climate Change. This is a 5-year research project that is being funded through the Government of Canada with research teams that are based out of the University of Waterloo. The peatlands in Canada are located on the lands and traditional territories of many Indigenous nations who have and continue to safeguard this land, and the project sees the inclusion of Indigenous peoples as key to its success. The project team has added an Open to Collaborate notice to its website to help signify their commitment to ethical engagement with Indigenous communities across the project. Now here I do want to note that the French version of the Can Peat website also includes the Open to Collaborate notice, and you can see here it's been translated into French. And finally, continuing on with this example, Can Peat has added an Open to Collaborate notice to their dedicated Indigenous Data Sovereignty webpage, which is where they encourage their researchers to use our Local Context Hub website as a tool for identifying the presence of Indigenous land in their peatland research activities. So to assist with these efforts, the Can Peat team has created a comprehensive guide that contains information geared towards researchers who have already completed data collection or who have access to historically gathered data. Now, they do plan to create a future companion guide as well to provide further guidance for researchers who are working with a specific Indigenous nation or community in ongoing and future data collection opportunities. Now, this research guide is really fantastic and proactive work to see, so I do encourage you to check it out on the Can Peat website. So this next use of the Open to Collaborate notice is from Ocean Networks Canada, which is an ocean observing facility that some of you here on the call may be familiar with. ONC is working with First Nations to host their data that they wish to share and possibly apply labels. Now, as part of this process and commitment to this work, ONC has added Open to Collaborate notices on a few places on their website, including here in their community involvement and data policy pages.
So this example here is a use of the Open to Collaborate notice by Simon Fraser University on their Northwest Coast Image Archive, which is one of the most highly utilized collections within the library. In contrast to the previous example that showed the use of a notice across an archive or a specific department, this example is being used on a specific collection. The notice is used here to acknowledge limited attribution within the collection and the institution's commitment to working with communities to improve this.
Yeah, so here we have an example of notices in use on an even more granular, item-specific level. The University of Alberta Library Archives have added Open to Collaborate notices to 45 individual accession records that have Indigenous rights and interests that are associated. So as you can see in this record, they've decided to include the notice in the credits field. I do also want to note that the University of Alberta is also using Open to Collaborate notices on their archive search page. So as we mentioned, notices can be applied at that higher level across an archive or collection. They can be applied to a specific collection, and they can also be applied on a single item or record.
This is the White Museum using the Open to Collaborate and Attribution Incomplete notices on its community collaboration page, where they're looking to enrich what they know about the living objects in their collection. Pictured here is a beaded vest from their collection, which they are hoping to receive community feedback around. The white uses notices to indicate they are committed to creating an ethical space for the preservation, presentation, and management of Indigenous cultural heritage. And here we have an example outside of the Canadian context, but which may be relevant to those of you working in the biocultural realm. This example shows a BC notice or biocultural notice added to the genome sequence of the bilberry, which is a shrub that has been a significant source of nutrition for the Sami people who are indigenous to Northern Europe. The samples used to assemble the genome were collected on Sami lands. The international team of researchers placed a BC notice on the genome hosted in the genome database for Vaccinium, GDV, to acknowledge the indigenous provenance and rights associated with the bilberry and this specific research. The researchers also placed the notice on the publication in Molecular Ecology Resources that is associated with the data. The notice icon was included in one of the publication figures and the text included in the data availability statement.
Yeah, so as we showed in the past few slides, we've looked at the tools that institutions and researchers can use, which are notices. But we also want to take a couple of minutes here to talk about the labels, which are tools for Indigenous communities. Now, through collaboration, labels can be applied by communities to institution and researcher collections or data. The local context labels support Indigenous communities to reinsert their cultural authority and sovereignty into spaces. Communities can use these labels to clearly state the provenance, protocols, and permissions of their belongings or materials.
So the goal of the labels is to support the basic acknowledgement and attribution to disrupt settler systems, but they also move towards supporting Indigenous authorship and access, and further beyond that to Indigenous authority and autonomy and institutional accountability. Both the Biocultural and BC and TK labels have been developed over the past decade out of international community partnership and iteration. Each of the labels has a different meaning or purpose. Like the notices, the labels are educational, and they're also not tied to who owns the material. The labels offer a visible indicator to anyone who accesses the material to understand its significance to the communities from where it derives and continues to have meaning. They can be used by communities to express their conditions for sharing in ways that are consistent with existing community rules, governance, and protocols. You can see here the icons for our labels. On the left are the 20 traditional knowledge or TK labels, and on the right are the 10 biocultural or BC labels. The traditional knowledge or TK labels are for use on cultural heritage. TK labels identify cultural materials that has community-specific conditions regarding access and use. The biocultural BC labels were developed to support community expectations for biocultural collections or data. The BC labels are to support Indigenous people's right to decide how collections and data that come from their lands and waters are used. The labels' meanings are related to these three categories of provenance, where something comes from, protocol, how it should be assessed, and permissions, how it should be used into the future. There are more labels than notices. This is because the labels are more specific. The labels are being used by communities on their own belongings and information. The notices, meanwhile, are being applied by institutions and researchers who are stewarding their belongings and information and are being used to clearly identify the Indigenous rights and responsibilities when clearly identify that Indigenous rights and responsibilities are present, not what those rights and responsibilities are. That remains the right of the Indigenous community.
Great. So now let's take a look at what these labels actually look like. Here we're looking at the TK attribution label, which is about naming and putting proper attribution back into records. We can review the three main parts of the label: the icon, title, and description. Even though they are similar to the notices, they work a bit differently. Uh, every community can create their own set of labels. Each of the labels comes with template text, but to further support community sovereignty, communities have the option to customize certain aspects of their labels. The icon does not change and is not editable. We've decided to keep the iconography consistent because our labels are used around the world and standardization is useful for recognition purposes. The title, TK attribution, is a standard title name which can be used in addition to the community's name for the label, which is oftentimes a translation of the title into their own language. The description here is template text. Of course, the communities can use this text as is. They can add or insert their name where appropriate, and they can completely write their own version of this description. The community has the right and power to decide what to include in a label's description. This is an expression of sovereignty that adds specificity and local conditions and meanings around the idea of the label. We'll dive in next a little bit deeper into customization by looking at a community's customized version of this label.
Great, thank you for that overview, Ashley. So first, we want to share an example from the Scowlitz Band of the Stolo First Nation, which is located in what is today known as British Columbia. So this is a screenshot of the homepage of their website, and you might be able to see that in that top right corner, there are label icons. Now, clicking on those label icons will show the full table text. Now, for the purposes of comparison, you can see here the Scowlitz label is next to the label template text. So the Scowlitz have titled the label into their own language, Hulka Malem, and the label text also explains what this label means to them as a community, which is all about telling their own story in their own words. So by using the labels on their website, the Scowlitz are labeling the information and stories shared here as their true knowledge and history, and are asking for viewers to use this in a respectful way and to attribute the Scowlitz. Now, to build off of this example, I do want to share that the Scowlitz have included French language translations of labels throughout their website as well, which you can see here. This next example of labels in use is in a digital publication titled As I Remember It. Now, this is a book by Slamin elder Elsie Paul, which was published online by University of British Columbia Press's Raven Space Publishing. This is a revised digital multimedia edition of a book of the same title. With the online version, you can learn about the Slamin language, you can listen to Elsie tell her stories in videos, as well as watch short animations and more. There are multiple sections of the publication where labels are in use. So in this colonialism chapter, for example, there are 4 labels that have been applied, which you can see beneath the title: TK Outreach, TK Attribution, TK Non-Commercial, and finally TK Culturally Sensitive. The attribution, non-commercial, and outreach labels are used and included on all sections, meaning this material is being shared for educational purposes and asking for appropriate attribution and non-commercial use. The culturally sensitive label is used on 3 sections, including in this colonialism chapter, which includes stories and histories of the ongoing nature of settler colonialism and genocidal practices.
We also wanted to show the use of a community's label on institutional websites and repositories, so we're including a few examples outside of the Canadian context for that purpose. You may be familiar with this example. It's featured in one of our short films. We're looking at a screenshot of a page in the Library of Congress's online catalog. This is an entry for a recording of Passamaquoddy songs and stories made in what is today known as Maine. You can see on the right side, 3 labels have been applied by the Passamaquoddy on this record. The Passamaquoddy felt comfortable sharing cultural information to be added to the Library of Congress record more than what can be pictured in the screenshot, because they were able to apply their TK labels. TK attribution that they added is the tribe asking for the correct attribution whenever this record or this recording is referenced, which might be correctly attributing to the Passamaquoddy tribe or individual Passamaquoddy names. The TK outreach label, the tribe has shared this information for educational purposes to share about the Passamaquoddy culture and worldviews. And then lastly, the TK non-commercial, where the tribe would like this material not to be used for commercial purposes by non-Passamaquoddy people.
So Manaaki Whenua, or Landcare Research, is a research institution located in Aotearoa, New Zealand. They have a collection of biological samples, such as arthropods, plants, fungi. These are all collections of national significance and are at a large scale, representing over 700,000 species or specimen records, which are available on their online database, a view of which we're looking at here. So using the Hub website API, they've applied notices to each of those over 700,000 entries. And then following up from that, they've also worked with 3 iwi or tribes, who then applied labels to a selection of those records. So all of the records in those collections that came from their territories. You can see here, this particular record is for a herbarium specimen collected from the Whakatohea homelands. That's my community. And we added the BC research use, the BC open to commercialization, the BC provenance, and the BC consent verified labels. Adding these labels indicate that Whakatohea have permissioned the use of these specimens for research purposes, are open to commercialization opportunities that might derive from this data, and are marking the specimen's provenance to being within Whakatohea's area of interest, and detailing that consent conditions were in place for the use of the specimen.
So to close us out, we'd like to end with an overview of a few suggestions for getting started. Just to note that these steps are iterative and part of continuous processes that can feed into each other. These recommendations may not be relevant in all contexts, but are just a few general steps that we have seen to be helpful. And we do recommend starting with learning, which everyone in this room is already doing that, which is fantastic. We recommend checking out in particular our short films and support pages on our website as well. We also have working groups and networks so that you can connect with others doing this work, and we'll talk a little bit more about that Canada Network and Technical Implementation Working Group. We also recommend taking stock of your collections, data, and policies to gain a better understanding of your context and what information you might need. Next, for those who are interested in using local contexts in their institution or community, we would recommend institutional or community preparation as a step. This includes having conversations with others, because this work cannot be done alone, and you may also need to develop new policies around Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. Now, if you are going to be adding notices or labels into platforms such as databases, there will be some technical preparation that will also need to take place. So speaking of that, implementation, our next step, does center around our Local Context Hub website. And this is a website that facilitates the application of labels into notices. So you can join the hub in a researcher or institution account to generate and apply notices, or you can create a community account to customize and apply labels. Community accounts can also apply labels to collections and data that are shared with them by institution and researcher accounts. Those notices or labels can then be added into your own systems. Now, in particular for institutions and researchers who will be using the notices, we recommend in that collaboration step to identify potential pilot projects. We do know that institutional collections and data can be overwhelming, so rather than taking that all on, we recommend identifying maybe a single collection or a data set to help establish workflows with local contexts. We also recommend institutions and researchers ensure they're establishing ethical, reciprocal relationships, which should be approached with consideration and respect, and in following community protocols. So we'll keep this slide up on the screen for a minute or so. There's just a couple of options of how to stay connected with us. So we have our website in which you can check out our blog, which has other examples of labels and notices in use, as well as important updates within our organization. You can reach us at our support email, which is on the slide here. So you can go subscribe to our newsletter, which does come out seasonally, as well as sign up for a support session. So we do have a info session and hub session scheduled in April, and we will be scheduling more out to come. And as mentioned, we do have a few working groups and networks, which could be particularly of interest to this group. So we have a Canada network, which is a really great fit to connect with others in the region doing this work, as well as a technical implementation working group, which could be helpful for some of you. And I'll let Ashley speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, so I'm one of the co-chairs of the Technical Implementation Working Group, and that's where we've been meeting to kind of discuss more about how the labels and notices can be implemented into various platforms and systems. Over the past year, we've tried to focus a bit more on metadata structures. So if that is of interest to anyone, please definitely sign up for that. And we try to meet quarterly every year.
Yeah, so with that, we just want to say thank you so much for having us, for letting us speak here with the Alliance. So we did want to open up to any questions, ideas, or discussion that anybody might be interested in diving into.
While that's emerging, I'll answer a couple of the questions that were in the chat. There was one there just really talking about how our Indigenous communities thinking about working with data repositories. So in part, the labels were developed alongside a project that was a Indigenous content management system, so Mercutu, and that was being put together to help Indigenous communities sort of curate and manage their own collections. So you've got sort of a one, I guess, activity which you see also happening in other places where people are making use of platforms to, communities are making use of platforms to store their own connections, but then they're also working alongside other data repositories to make sure that there's, kind of relevant metadata in place. So it's really a sort of a whole spectrum where the labels can be used and applied to.
Thank you so much, Maui. We just had a question come into the chat. Can you discuss a bit more about working with tribal governments to integrate the labels into policies? So examples, data sharing agreements, THPO archives, schools, post-secondary, etc.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's sort of activities that happen both in a sort of an Indigenous or a tribal space, but also in institutional ones. And I think their application in any of those locations often requires some kind of support or activities that help it. We recognize that the labels themselves are one tool that are useful for some context and some of the challenges that people have when they're thinking about protecting or maintaining control over their information and data. And so often, I think that was the reference that Emily made to Indigenous data sovereignty policies or Indigenous cultural and intellectual policies, the CARE principles, the OCAP principles. Sometimes there are things that need to be in place in that area that provide a scaffold or a bit of a framework within which then the tools sit, or the labels and notices sit. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Emily?
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I would say we have seen be helpful is sort of beginning memorandums of agreement, so MOUs as well, just to sort of help clarify for both parties what are some expectations, what are some guidelines, what are some ground rules that need to be respected and considered when entering into that kind of partnership.
And in some ways, this connects to the question that was in the chat, not in the chat, in the Q&A, talking about, you know, to what degree are the labels legally enforceable, and where they sit in relation to Creative Commons, sort of the Creative Commons licenses. So one of the challenges and one of the reasons why the labels were developed was because you could only apply a Creative Commons license if you were the copyright holder in the first place. So if the community is excluded from that process, or that is something that's been claimed by the institutional researcher just through our sort of regular practices, or the material is sort of older or, you know, traditional beyond the sort of the scope of when you might be able to have copyright apply, then it's no longer a tool that can be used. However, the sort of protections that, or the frameworks that might need to be put in place, are going to make use of both legal tools and extra legal tools. And we see the labels as the extra legal component, and where there are places where people can use legal tools, and that might be through memorandums, the memorandums of understanding, research agreements, making use of copyright in different places as things emerge, then they're going to make use of those things as well. So it's really trying to think about how they layer together and what is the best use of each tool to get the outcome you're looking for.
Yeah, now Panalamu, it's great to thank you for all the information. Greetings from the Karen Quechua Nation here in South America. I was, as I hear in the legal part of this, I would like to see if you have done any work in unintended consequences that these labels and notices might have to communities. Primarily, as you show the map internationally, we're talking about with tribal recognized federal or a state that has their own bureaucratic government system that has a different layer of constitutional rights. And that could have the implementation of these labels and notices in the legal entity, as you mentioned, the extra layer that this will be in the legality of this. However, for the global South, I can speak from Africa and many of the colleagues in Pacific and Latin America. That is not the case for our communities and collective groups. We don't have that kind of recognition. So I see the possibility of unintended consequences by adding this and making communities visible for bioprospecting, all the way to bioprocessing, all the way to data mining and biological pollution. So I will just like a little bit clarity in this, what might be the work being done or the work that is done that I could learn more as I'm working in building the infrastructure here in the Global South.
Yeah, kia ora, Patrick, that's a great question. It's actually, you know, it's this really sort of tricky one in lots of ways. The labels themselves are sort of or the application of the labels are predicated in some ways on having a community that is able to express its cultural authority and has some sort of organization in place that allows an accountability internally that allows that to take place. In some places like Aotearoa New Zealand, where we've, you know, become fairly organized around what that looks like, it becomes easier. In some other countries, that's not possible. We are sort of conscious that there's kind of the challenges of visibility and transparency, and when that's sort of something that supports Indigenous self-determination, but there's also contexts where that doesn't help. I guess we've really been in the position of going that transparency is going to be more helpful in the long run, because it's about because a lot of the collection of samples and information is happening anyway. And unless you're in a position where you have a degree of authority to physically stop that happening in your space, your ability to then control the things or have an influence or express an interest in the things that are being taken off those lands is diminished if you don't sort of kind of stand up. So it's not as we're saying, it's, we know it's not a solution for everything, and it is really up to communities themselves to decide whether they want to go down that track. There may be challenges in the future with people claiming interest in an area where someone else feels they have an interest, but we're dealing with that in the New Zealand context as things stand, and making it in areas where there's sort of overlapping interests that both communities can add labels to those records. Yeah, so I think that's all I can say about that at the moment. But it's definitely an interesting one. It's worthwhile following up and separately around these questions.
Thank you so much. We have a question in the Q&A. So Anyai, for your work and providing this service, we are in partnership to develop tribal data systems or platforms to store data and or have data sharing agreements in place to prepare for future repositories and existing data infrastructure development. With local contexts, can you move from evaluators/researchers to community accounts or vice versa? And what would you advise?
I'm happy to start this one off. So we have not yet had a chance to kind of show what the hub looks like, really the platform where that helps facilitate the application of the labels or the notices based on who's doing the work. That is really how kind of the workflow is managed between communities and institutions and researchers. So within the hub, each person can have their own profile to log in, and each profile can be associated with any of the account types. So you could be a part of both a community and an institution account. And the reason why we created it in that way, kind of what Emily had mentioned previously, is we understand that a lot of this work can overlap, especially with those that are working within communities, but also maybe helping manage institution collection or vice versa. So there can be multiple accounts associated with one profile. And when it comes to the actual work that's being done, let's say the application of the notices or the labels, we just recommend that the projects, which kind of encompass that scope of work, is created and worked on within the account that's managing it. And any of the accounts can be added to a project as a contributor as well. So the work itself being done within the hub can span across multiple accounts that may be managed by many different people. That's at least the hub side. I don't know if Emily or Maui wants to jump in there.
Yeah, I think just to add to some of what Ashley was saying, if you are curious about starting to test out some of those workflows, we do have a sandbox hub, which is essentially a test site, which is designed for you to sort of create practice projects, maybe practice some of those workflows in terms of sharing a project with a community from a researcher perspective, with the community from an institution perspective. So it can really help sort of maybe allow a little bit more clarity in terms of what is possible within your systems as well, and sort of also help you think through maybe what other colleagues or what other departments within your organization might need to sort of be wrapped into the conversation. So hopefully that helps, and we can definitely follow up in a follow-up email with that link to the Sandbox Hub as well, which we do encourage you to sort of create an account, sign in, and play around with how local context might work for you.
there's often people that will join up to the local context and have a number of different relationships. So you can join up and you might be a part of multiple institutions, or you may be a part of an institution and a community. You may start as a researcher, but then also become a part, be represented in an institutional account. So we kind of recognize that people have different roles at different times, but to be a part of an institution, the institution has to claim you. To be a part of the community has to claim you and say that it's okay for you to be, kind of operating within their space.
Thank you so much for that. So I have a question here. Would recommend presenting at intertribal policy groups, so ATNI, USET, NCAI, etc., and perhaps seek a resolution that support the local context model, would empower this work and help to better ensure tribes in the US and First Nations and other treaty agreement sovereign nations are both aware of this platform, as well as consider integrating into their standards and practices. So more of a comment than a question, but would love to hear if you have anything to say on that.
Yeah, look, we're always happy to engage and support those activities. We know that there's a lot of attention is often given to the institutions and the places where the information is, but equally we need to be working closely with tribal entities and nations, so that they're become empowered to engage with those communities, with those institutions themselves, and think about how they can use different tools to support them on their journeys for self-determination.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and say, if there is anybody in the Zoom room who is from Indigenous perspective, an Indigenous community in Canada, and would like sort of an info session or a run through of local context with some of the people within your community, we are always interested and willing to sort of create that time and space to talk through the local context labels for any First Nations who might be interested. So that support at email would be a really great place to connect with us, and then we can schedule something from there.
Thanks so much. And then I just see one last question here. So Jordan says, thanks for a great presentation and the discussion, and then asks, would you be able to speak a little more about the overlapping labeling mentioned? So it seems like the sort of need that institutions often handle poorly, example, the NAGPRA contexts.
Yeah, so in part this is so there's a few way labels overlapping interests and areas might be dealt with, and we've seen that happen in kind of different places. If you think about areas where there may be alliances or confederations of tribes that work together, and they have a sort of, whether they've constructed an entity or an arrangement that can then act on behalf of an area. And so in some places where there's an overlapping interest, they collaborate and create a collective authority that then can be the entity that applies the label. And other places where you might not be wanting to, that sort of arrangement might not be in place, or the relationships that support that kind of outcome aren't in place, then the labels aren't exclusive because they aren't sort of legal in a way. And so lots of the places where we have kind of challenges between different entities or between different kind of tribal nations is when we're talking about ownership of something, ownership of land, ownership of some kind of item, and the sort of ownership element of it is what then creates some kind of tensions and often more fixed boundaries. Because this is sort of expressing an interest and expressing something which people would like to assert some authority over, there's going to be a range of things that go from this is clearly belongs to this family. And if you look at our sort of provenance labels, sometimes we have a TK family or TK clan or TK in relation to the tribe, because we know that there's responsibilities that sit at different levels for different types of things, and so they can essentially work that out and put those share that understanding that they have with people externally.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I don't see any more questions coming in, and I think we've answered everything in the chat and in the Q&A. So at this point, I think we're ready to wrap up. So once again, a heartfelt thank you to our presenters from local contexts. Really appreciate you being here with us today to talk about the incredible work that you are doing. And a big thank you to our interpreters who have permitted us to offer this bilingually, both in English and French. We hope that that was helpful for our Francophone community. And finally, obviously, a big thank you to all of you who attended the session today, and wishing you all a great rest of your day.